The flag was folded 13 times when they handed it to me. 13 precise folds that transformed the symbol of everything I'd fought for into a perfect triangle of blue and white stars. But that morning, standing outside St. Michael's Catholic Church in my dress blues, I wasn't thinking about military protocol or ceremonial honors. I was thinking about the woman who used to iron that same flag every 4th of July, hanging it proudly on the front porch of her little house on Elm Avenue. My grandmother Elena Rodriguez had been gone for 3 days, and my own parents had made it crystal clear that I wasn't welcome at her funeral. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had served 12 years protecting the freedoms that allowed them to grieve, to gather, to say goodbye. I had missed birthdays, holidays, and countless family dinners to serve my country. But when it came time to honor the woman who raised me when they couldn't, who wrote me letters every week during deployment, who kept my childhood bedroom exactly as I left it, I was suddenly persona non grata in my own family. My name is Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, and I've spent the last 12 years of my life in the United States Navy. I've served 3 tours overseas, earned commendations that most people will never see, and dedicated my life to something bigger than myself. But none of that mattered to the 2 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. What mattered to them was that I had chosen duty over family dinners, service over Sunday Mass, and honor over their expectations of what a daughter should be. The call came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning. I was at Naval Station Great Lakes, finishing up some late paperwork when my phone buzzed against the metal desk. The number was familiar, but the timing wasn't. My family knew better than to call during duty hours, unless it was an emergency. When I saw my brother Daniel's name on the screen, my stomach dropped before I even answered. Maria. His voice was strained, hollow. It's Grandma Elena. She's gone. The words hit differently than enemy fire ever had. In combat, you expect the worst. You train for it, prepare for it, steel yourself against it. But sitting in that sterile office at 3 in the morning, surrounded by the quiet hum of computers and the distant sound of late shift personnel, I wasn't prepared for the way grief could gut you so completely. Elena Rodriguez had been the anchor of our family for as long as I could remember. While my parents worked double shifts to keep food on the table, she was the one who helped with homework, who bandaged scraped knees, who listened to my dreams of seeing the world beyond Riverside, Ohio. She was the one who never questioned my decision to enlist, who never made me feel guilty for choosing a path that took me away from home. When? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday evening, heart failure. It was peaceful. Daniel's words came out mechanical, rehearsed. The funeral is Saturday at St. Michael's, viewing is Friday night. I was already calculating travel time, thinking about emergency leave requests, when Daniel's next words stopped me cold. Maria, there's something else. Mom and Dad, they don't want you there. The silence stretched between us across the miles, heavy and suffocating. What do you mean they don't want me there? They're saying you've been absent for too long, that you abandoned the family, that Grandma Elena died asking for you, and you weren't here. His voice cracked slightly. They think your presence will just cause drama, make it about you instead of about her. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Daniel, I was deployed. You know I was deployed. I couldn't just leave my post because I know that. Jessica knows. But Mom and Dad, they're not thinking straight right now. They're hurt, and they're angry, and they need someone to blame. The unfairness of it burned in my throat. I had missed family gatherings, yes. I had been absent for holidays and birthdays, and casual Sunday dinner. But I had never missed anything by choice. Every deployment, every extended training exercise, every time duty called me away from home, it tore at me. The letters I wrote to Grandma Elena from halfway around the world were filled with promises to make up for lost time, to come home and sit on her front porch and listen to her stories about Grandpa Miguel's service in Korea. She understood, I said quietly. Grandma Elena understood why I couldn't always be there. I know she did, but Mom and Dad, they're different. They never understood why you left in the first place. That much was true. From the moment I announced my intention to enlist, my parents had made their disapproval clear. They wanted me to stay in Riverside, to find a nice local job, to get married and give them grandchildren they could see every weekend. They wanted me to be like Jessica, who married Daniel straight out of high school and never lived more than 10 miles from the house where she was born. But I had wanted something different. I had wanted to serve, to see the world, to be part of something that mattered, and Grandma Elena had been the only one who supported that dream. The conversation with Daniel ended with hollow promises to work things out, to talk to our parents, to find some middle ground. But I knew better. I had seen the look in my father's eyes the last time I was home on leave, the way he flinched when neighbors thanked him for his daughter's service. I had heard the edge in my mother's voice when she talked about missing church services, because I wasn't there to drive Grandma Elena. I submitted my emergency leave request that same morning. Commander Jake Thompson approved it without question, his weathered face softening when I explained the situation. He had been in the Navy for 26 years, and he understood the weight of family obligations that couldn't be met, the guilt that came with choosing duty over present. "Take all the time you need, Rodriguez," he said, signing the paperwork with practiced efficiency. "And don't let anyone make you feel guilty for serving your country." But guilt wasn't something I could leave behind with my duty station. It followed me on the 6-hour drive from Great Lakes to Riverside, sat passenger in my rental car as I navigated the familiar streets of my childhood. It was there when I pulled into the driveway of 24 Maple Street, the modest 2-story house where I had grown up, where my parents still lived, where they were undoubtedly planning a funeral I wasn't invited to attend. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint a little more faded, the front steps showing signs of wear that hadn't been there during my last visit. I sat in the car for a long moment, watching the windows for signs of movement, trying to summon the courage to walk up to the front door of my childhood home, and face the people who had given me life but couldn't understand the life I had chosen. When I finally knocked, it was my mother who answered. Patricia Rodriguez had always been a small woman, but grief had made her seem even more fragile. Her dark hair was streaked with more gray than I remembered, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. For just a moment, when she first saw me, her face softened with something that might have been relief, but it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a hardness I had never seen directed at me before. "Maria," my name came out flat, emotionless. I wanted to reach for her, to fold her into a hug the way I had during every homecoming before this one, but something in her posture warned me off. "I came as soon as I could. I'm so sorry about Grandma Elena." She didn't step aside to let me in. "Your father and I have discussed this. We think it's best if you stay away from the services." The words hit like a physical blow. "Mom, she was my grandmother too. I loved her. If you loved her, you would have been here when she needed you." The accusation came out sharp, cutting. "She spent the last 3 months asking for you. Every day, Maria. Every single day she would ask when you were coming home, and I had to tell her I didn't know." I felt my own anger rising, hot and defensive. "I was deployed. You know I was deployed. I couldn't just abandon my duties because the Navy is more important than family, because strangers matter more than the woman who raised you when we couldn't." My mother's voice rose, years of resentment spilling out. "She died calling your name. She died waiting for a granddaughter who cared more about playing soldier than about being present." The accusation stung because there was just enough truth in it to hurt. I had chosen to re-enlist when I could have come home. I had volunteered for deployments that took me further from Rivers. I had built a life that existed entirely separate from the people who shared my blood and my history. But I had also saved lives. I had served my country with honor. I had stood watch so others could sleep safely. I had earned the respect of my peers and superiors through dedication and sacrifice. And none of that seemed to matter to the woman standing in the doorway, blocking my entry into the home where I had learned to walk and talk and dream. "Where's Dad?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "At the funeral home, making arrangements that don't include you." The finality in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't grief talking, or momentary anger that would pass with time. This was a decision, deliberate and absolute. I tried once more. "Mom, please, let me say goodbye to her. Let me be there for the family." "You haven't been there for the family for 12 years, Maria. Why start now?" The door closed with a quiet click, leaving me standing on the front steps of my childhood home, with nowhere to go and no way to honor the woman who had meant everything to me. I drove to Grandma Elena's house on Elm Avenue, parking in the driveway where her old Buick used to sit. The house was dark, empty, waiting for decisions about what to do with a lifetime of memory. I had a key, had always had a key, tucked away in my wallet like a promise that I would always have a place to belong. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The kitchen still smelled like the coffee she brewed every morning, strong and bitter the way Grandpa Miguel had taught her to make it. The living room was dominated by the same floral sofa, where she used to sit and listen to my stories during rare visits home, nodding and smiling and never once making me feel like I had disappointed her by leaving. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a collection of photographs spanning decades. Wedding pictures of her and Grandpa Miguel, young and hopeful and dressed in their finest clothes. Pictures of my father as a child, then as a young man starting his own family. Pictures of Daniel and me growing up, school portraits and birthday parties and Christmas morning. But it was the newest addition that stopped me cold. A photograph I had never seen before, one that must have been added recently. It was a picture of me in my dress blues, taken during my promotion ceremony 2 years ago. I remembered sending it to her in a letter, along with a long explanation of what the new rank meant, what responsibilities it carried. I had included it almost as an afterthought, the way you might include a casual snapshot. But she had placed it in the center of the mantel, right next to her wedding photo and pictures of her late husband in his army uniform. She had honored my service in the same way she honored his, with pride and love and unwavering support. I sank onto her sofa and finally let myself cry. Not the controlled, quiet tears I had learned to shed in private during deployment, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who had lost the only person who truly understood the weight of service, the cost of choosing duty over comfort.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The viewing was scheduled for Friday evening at Henderson Memorial Chapel. I knew I wouldn't be welcome, but I also knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to pay my respect. I waited until late, hoping the initial crowd would have thinned, hoping I might slip in unnoticed and have a few quiet moments with the woman who had shaped so much of who I had become. Henderson Memorial was a fixture in Riverside, the kind of place where 3 generations of families had said their final goodbyes. The parking lot was still full when I arrived, a testament to how beloved Grandma Elena had been in the community. She had volunteered at the church for 60 years, had organized countless fundraisers for local charities, had been the kind of neighbor who showed up with casseroles when families faced hard times. I sat in my car for a long time, watching people come and go. Neighbors I recognized from childhood, carrying flowers and wearing the somber expressions reserved for occasions like these. Former co-workers of my father's, elderly women who had been part of Grandma Elena's church circle, young families, whose children she had doted on at community events. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, I was stopped at the door by Daniel. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of mediating between grief and family politics. But his face was kind when he saw me, apologetic in a way that told me he had fought for my inclusion and love. "Maria, you can't be here. Mom and Dad specifically asked the funeral director to keep you out." The humiliation burned hot in my chest. To be banned from a public viewing, to be treated like some kind of threat or disturbance, was beyond anything I had imagined. "Daniel, please, 5 minutes, that's all I need." I really tried to talk to them, but they're not budging. They think your being here will cause a scene, will make people talk about family drama instead of celebrating Grandma Elena's life. I could hear voices from inside, the low murmur of conversation mixed with soft music. I could smell the flowers, see the soft lighting that funeral homes use to create an atmosphere of peaceful reflection. And I could feel the weight of being excluded from it all, shut out of the final opportunity to say goodbye to the woman who had loved me unconditionally. "She would have wanted me here," I said quietly. "I know, Jessica knows, hell, even Mom and Dad know, deep down, but they're hurting, and they need someone to blame for all the time they feel like they lost with her." Daniel glanced back toward the viewing room, then stepped closer to me. "There's something else. They're not just banning you from the viewing, they don't want you at the funeral either. They've made it clear that if you show up, they'll ask you to leave." The words landed like a physical blow. To be excluded from the funeral itself, from the final ceremony that would mark the end of Grandma Elena's presence in this world, was a cruelty I hadn't imagined my own parents capable of. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and turned to leave. But Daniel caught my arm. "For what it's worth, I don't agree with this. Neither does Jessica. And there are a lot of people in there who have been asking about you, wondering why you're not here." He squeezed my arm gently. "She loved you, Maria. Never doubt that. She was proud of your service, proud of the woman you became. She used to brag about you to anyone who would listen." I drove back to Grandma Elena's house and spent the night surrounded by her things, by the tangible reminders of a life well lived and a love that transcended distance and duty. I read through the letters she had written to me over the years, each one carefully saved, each one filled with encouragement and pride and unwavering support for my choices. In the morning, I would have to figure out how to honor her memory from a distance. I would have to find a way to say goodbye without being allowed to attend the formal ceremonies that marked the end of her life. I would have to live with the knowledge that my own parents had chosen punishment over compassion, exclusion over inclusion, in the darkest hour of our family's grief. But that night, sitting in her living room, surrounded by photographs and memories, I made a promise to the woman who had always believed in me. I would find a way to honor her properly. I would find a way to make sure her love of country and service was remembered. And I would find a way to bridge the gap between duty and family that had cost us all so much. What I didn't know was that 8 miles away, at VFW Post 4582, a conversation was taking place that would change everything. A conversation between men and women who understood service, who honored sacrifice, and who had known Elena Rodriguez as a Gold Star wife who never stopped supporting the military community her husband had died serving. What I didn't know was that sometimes, when family fails you, a different kind of family steps up to fill the void. The morning of Grandma Elena's funeral dawned gray and overcast, the kind of Ohio weather that seemed to mirror the heaviness in my chest. I had spent the night at her house, surrounded by the familiar scent of her lavender sachets and the quiet tick of the grandfather clock Grandpa Miguel had built with his own hands 50 years ago. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by dreams of childhood summers and the sound of her voice calling me in for lunch after long afternoons playing in her backyard. I dressed carefully in my navy dress blues, the uniform I had worn with pride at ceremonies around the world. The ribbons and insignia told the story of my service, each piece of metal and fabric representing missions completed, lives protected, duties fulfilled. But this morning, putting on that uniform felt different. It wasn't armor against the world's dangers or a symbol of professional achievement. It was a statement, a quiet declaration that I would honor Grandma Elena in the only way left to me. The funeral was scheduled for 10 o'clock at St. Michael's Catholic Church, the same church where Elena Rodriguez had attended Mass every Sunday for 63 years. I knew I couldn't go inside, knew that my presence would only create the kind of scene my parents were so desperate to avoid. But I also knew I couldn't stay away entirely. She had earned the right to have me there, even if it had to be from a distance. I drove to the church early, parking across the street where I could see the front entrance but remain out of sight of the mourners who would soon arrive. The building looked exactly as it had during my childhood, red brick and stained glass windows that caught the morning light and threw colored patterns across the sidewalk. Grandma Elena had taken me to Mass there every Sunday when my parents worked weekend shifts, teaching me the prayers in both English and Spanish, showing me how faith could be a source of strength during difficult times. As I sat in my car watching the empty church, I thought about all the conversations we had shared in that building, the whispered explanations during long services, the patient answers to my endless questions about saints and miracles and why some people suffered while others prospered. She had never claimed to have all the answers, but she had taught me that asking the questions was important, that faith was something you built through doubt as much as through certainty. People began arriving around 9:30, a steady stream of mourners dressed in their finest black clothes. I recognized many of them despite the years that had passed since I had lived in Riverside. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, now walking with a cane but still wearing the bright red lipstick she had favored for as long as I could remember. Miss Kowalski from the hardware store, his shoulders more stooped than they had been in my youth but his face still kind and weathered. The Gonzalez family from across the street, now including grandchildren, I had never met but who carried themselves with the same quiet dignity that had always characterized their parents. Each familiar face was a reminder of the community I had left behind, the network of neighbors and friends who had known me when I was simply Maria Rodriguez, Bob and Pat's youngest daughter, the girl who helped Elena tend her garden and asked too many questions during church service. Seeing them now gathering to honor the woman who had been a constant presence in all their lives, made my exclusion feel even more profound. At 5 minutes to 10, the hearse arrived, its black exterior polished to a mirror shine despite the gray morning. Behind it came a procession of cars carrying my family, and I felt my breath catch when I saw my parents emerge from the lead vehicle. My father looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, his movements careful and deliberate. My mother leaned heavily on his arm, and I could see from across the street that she was crying. Daniel appeared next, helping Jessica out of their car while their 2 young children, dressed in their best clothes, held hands between their parents. I had missed so much of their growing up, had seen them only in photographs and video calls that never quite captured the reality of who they were becoming. Watching them now solemn and confused about why their aunt wasn't with them, made my throat tight with regret. But it was the final car that broke my heart completely. 6 elderly men emerged, all wearing military dress uniforms from different eras and branches of service. I recognized them as members of VFW Post 4582, the group Grandpa Miguel had belonged to before his death 15 years ago. They moved with the careful precision of age and ceremony, forming an honor guard that would escort Elena Rodriguez to her final rest as the widow of a veteran who had given his life in service to his country. They carried the casket with reverence and dignity, these old soldiers who understood the weight of sacrifice and the cost of duty. And as they disappeared into the church where I was not welcome, I felt something crack inside my chest. This was what I had feared most. Not just missing the funeral but watching from a distance as others honored the woman who had meant everything to me. The service lasted 90 minutes. I know because I sat in that car for every moment of it, watching the closed doors of the church and imagining the prayers being said, the hymns being sung, the memories being shared. I knew the liturgy by heart from all those childhood Sundays, could hear Father Martinez's voice in my mind as he spoke about eternal rest and perpetual light and the promise of reunion in paradise. When the doors finally opened and the mourners began to emerge, I felt a complex mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the formal ceremony was over, that Grandma Elena had been honored in the way she deserved. Dread because I knew the procession to Riverside Cemetery would pass directly by where I was parked, and I would have to watch her leave this world without being able to say goodbye. The honor guard emerged first, moving with the same careful precision they had shown early. Behind them came the family, my parents walking arm in arm with Daniel and Jessica following close behind. They looked exhausted, drained by grief and the weight of arrangements and decisions that death always demands. For a moment I felt a surge of compassion for them, that cut through my anger and hurt. Whatever our differences, they had lost someone precious too. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. As the procession formed up behind the hearse, my father spoke briefly to one of the funeral directors, gesturing toward my side of the street. The man nodded and walked directly toward my car, his expression professional but firm. I rolled down my window as he approached, my heart pounding with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The family has requested that you not be present for any part of today's services." The public nature of the humiliation was almost unbearable. Other mourners had noticed the interaction, were watching from across the street as I was formally asked to leave my grandmother's funeral. I could see neighbors I had grown up with pointing and whispering, could imagine the conversations that would follow about the Rodriguez family drama and the daughter who had been banished from saying goodbye to the woman who raised her. "I understand," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll go." I started the car and drove away, leaving behind the church where I had learned about faith and forgiveness, leaving behind the community that had shaped my childhood, leaving behind the last chance to be part of honoring Elena Rodriguez in the place where she had worshipped for more than 6 decades. But I didn't go far. I knew the route to Riverside Cemetery by heart, knew every turn and intersection between the church and the small plot where Grandpa Miguel waited for his wife of 57 years. I also knew that there was a hill overlooking the cemetery, a small rise where teenagers used to park and where I had often gone as a child to think and dream, and plan for a future that seemed impossibly distant. I drove to that hill and parked among the trees, close enough to see the graveside service but far enough away to remain unnoticed. From that distance the mourners looked small and fragile, gathered around a hole in the earth that seemed too small to contain all the love and memory and impact that Elena Rodriguez had brought to the world. The military honor guard performed their duties with practiced precision, folding the American flag that had draped her casket into the traditional triangle, presenting it to my mother with the words that had been spoken over military graves for generations. I could see her shoulders shake as she accepted it, could imagine the weight of that fabric in her hands and the finality it represented. I watched as each mourner placed a flower on the casket, as prayers were said and tears were shed, and promises were made to remember and honor and carry forward the lessons Elena Rodriguez had taught through her 90 years of life. I watched as my family stood together in their grief, supporting each other through the hardest part of saying goodbye. And I watched as they left, returning to their cars and their lives, and their shared memories while I remained on the hill, alone with my regret and my anger and my love for a woman I would never see again. The cemetery grew quiet, as the last car disappeared down the winding road that led back to town. The groundskeepers began their work with respectful efficiency, filling in the grave and arranging the flowers that had been left behind. I wanted to go down there, to stand at the edge of that fresh earth and speak the words I had been carrying in my heart for 3 days. But I knew that even here, even after the formal services were over, I was not well. Instead, I sat in my car and talked to her from a distance, telling her about the missions I had completed and the people I had served with, and the ways that my years in the Navy had shaped me into someone she could be proud of. I told her about the loneliness that came with choosing duty over comfort, about the nights when I had stared at foreign stars and wondered if I had made the right choices. I told her about the letters she had written that had sustained me through the darkest moments of deployment, about the care packages that had reminded me of home and love and unconditional acceptance. I told her I was sorry for missing so many holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sundays, sorry for not being there when she got sick, for not holding her hand during those final days when she asked for me and I was thousands of miles away serving strangers who would never know her name. Sorry for the way my choices had divided our family and created pain that would outlast her presence in our lives. But I also told her I was grateful for the childhood summers spent in her garden, learning the names of flowers and the patience required to nurture growing things. Grateful for the Sunday afternoons when she taught me to cook the recipes that had been passed down through generations of strong women, who had learned to make something beautiful out of whatever they had available. Grateful for the unconditional support she had given my dreams, even when those dreams took me far from the life she had known and understood. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows grew longer, I began to notice something strange happening in the cemetery below. Cars were arriving, not the formal procession of a funeral but the casual stream of people coming to pay individual respects. I watched through my binoculars as person after person approached Grandma Elena's grave, many of them carrying flowers or small mementos. But these weren't family members or close friends. Many of them were wearing military uniforms or veteran organization caps. Some walked with the careful gait of old soldiers. Others moved with the bearing of active duty personnel. They came alone or in small groups, standing quietly at the graveside for a few moments before placing their offerings and moving on. It took me a while to understand what I was seeing. Word had spread through Riverside's veteran community about Elena Rodriguez's funeral, about the Gold Star widow who had spent 60 years supporting military families and honoring the memory of her husband's service. Word had also spread about her granddaughter, the Navy Staff Sergeant, who had been banned from the funeral by family members who couldn't understand the cost of serving one's country. These men and women, many of whom had never met me but understood the weight of duty and sacrifice, were paying their respects not just to Grandma Elena, but to the service she had supported and the granddaughter she had been proud of. They were making a statement with their presence, honoring both the dead and the living in a way that transcended family politics and personal grievances. As the sun began to set, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and amber, I saw a convoy of vehicles approaching on the main road. 7 cars moving in formation, each one bearing the distinctive license plates and decals that marked them as belonging to active duty military personnel. They parked in a neat line along the cemetery's main drive, and I watched in amazement as uniformed figures emerged from each vehicle. 8 Navy personnel, all wearing dress blues identical to my own, formed up with military precision, and began walking toward Elena Rodriguez's grave. I could see the glint of insignia and ribbons even from my distant perch, could tell from their bearing and movement that these were not recent recruits, but experienced sailors who had earned the right to wear their uniforms with pride. I didn't recognize them at first, didn't understand how word of the funeral had reached beyond Riverside's local veteran community to active duty personnel who had no connection to our family. But as they approached the grave and I got a clearer view through my binoculars, I began to pick out familiar faces. Chief Petty Officer Lisa Chen, who had served with me during my second deployment and had become one of my closest friends in the service. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Williams, who had been part of my unit during the mission that had earned me my most recent commendation. Seaman Apprentice Rodriguez, no relation despite the name, who had looked up to me during his first assignment and had written to thank me for the mentorship I had provided. But it was the 8th figure that made my breath catch in my throat. Commander Jake Thompson, my commanding officer, the man who had approved my emergency leave and told me to take all the time I needed. He was here, 200 miles from his duty station, wearing his dress uniform on a Saturday evening to honor a woman he had never met. I watched in stunned silence as they formed a circle around the grave, as Commander Thompson stepped forward and began to speak. I couldn't hear the words from my position on the hill, but I could see the respect and solemnity of their bearing, could understand that they were performing some kind of ceremony that had nothing to do with official protocol and everything to do with personal honor. When they finished speaking, each of them placed something on the grave: flowers, military coins, small flags, tokens of respect for a Gold Star widow and her granddaughter who had been denied the chance to say goodbye. They stood in silence for several minutes, 8 sailors honoring a woman they had never met, because she had raised another sailor they respected and cared about. Then something happened that I will remember for the rest of my life. As one, they turned toward the hill where I was parked, came to attention, and rendered a perfect military salute. They had known I was there, had somehow understood that I would be watching from a distance, and they were acknowledging both my presence and my loss with the highest honor their profession could offer. I sat in my car with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the gesture and the loyalty it represented. These people, my chosen family in the military, had traveled hundreds of miles to do what my blood family would not allow. They had honored Elena Rodriguez and included me in that honor, bridging the gap between duty and family that had caused so much pain. As they returned to their vehicles and prepared to leave, I saw Commander Thompson break away from the group and walk toward the hill where I was parked. I rolled down my window as he approached, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Rodriguez," he said simply, his voice carrying the warmth and respect I had come to associate with his leadership. "We wanted you to know that you're not alone in." "Sir, I don't understand how you all knew to come here. Word travels fast in the Navy, especially when one of our own is hurting. Chief Chen got a call from someone at the local VFW, who knew about your situation. We couldn't let you go through this without support." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something I hadn't expected to see. It was an American flag, folded in the traditional triangle, identical to the one that had been presented to my mother at the graveside service. "This flew over Naval Station Great Lakes yesterday in honor of Elena Rodriguez, Gold Star widow and grandmother of Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. We thought you should have it." I took the flag with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the fabric and the meaning it carried. "Sir, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. Just know that your service matters, that your sacrifice is recognized, and that you have a family in the Navy that will always have your back." He paused, looking down at the cemetery where the last of the visitors were paying their respects. "Your grandmother would be proud of who you've become, Rodriguez. Don't let anyone tell you different." As the Navy personnel drove away and darkness settled over the cemetery, I finally worked up the courage to leave my car and walk down to Grandma Elena's grave. The headstone hadn't been placed yet, but the fresh earth was covered with flowers and mementos left by the steady stream of visitors who had come to pay their respects. I knelt in the soft dirt and finally spoke the words I had been carrying since Daniel's phone call 3 days earlier. I told her about the honor guard that had come to pay respects, about the flag that now rested in my hands, about the way her memory had brought together people who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. I told her that I understood now why she had supported my choice to serve, even when it meant missing family gatherings and ordinary moments. She had lived through her own military marriage, had understood the weight of duty and the cost of protecting something larger than yourself. She had known that love could transcend distance and time, that service was its own form of devotion. As I stood to leave, I noticed something else among the flowers and flags that had been left at the grave, a small handwritten note, tucked beneath a bouquet of roses. I picked it up and read it by the light of my phone, and the words took my breath away. Elena Rodriguez was a friend to every veteran who ever walked through the doors of VFW Post 4F. She fed us, listened to our stories, and made sure we knew we mattered. Her granddaughter serves with the same honor and dedication that Elena lived by every day. "We see you, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. We honor your service and your sacrifice, Semper Fi, from your brothers and sisters in arms." It was signed by more than 30 names, representing every branch of the military and spanning several decades of service. These people, many of whom I had never met, had taken the time to acknowledge both my grandmother's life and my own service in a way that my blood family could not. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my wallet next to the key to Grandma Elena's house, next to the photograph of her and Grandpa Miguel on their wedding day that I had carried through 3 deployments. These would be my touchstones, my reminders that family is not always determined by blood, that honor can be found in unexpected places, and that love takes many forms. The drive back to Grandma Elena's house was quiet, the streets of Riverside empty in the way that small towns become after dark. I let myself in with the key I had always carried, surrounded once again by the familiar scents and sounds of the place that had always felt like home. But something had changed during the hours I had spent at the cemetery. The house no longer felt like a refuge from family conflict, or a place to hide from the pain of exclusion. It felt like a beginning, a foundation on which to build something new and meaningful. I spent that night going through her papers, not looking for anything specific, but trying to understand the full scope of the life she had lived. What I found were records of decades of volunteer work, correspondence with military families, and documentation of charitable efforts that had touched hundreds of lives over the years. Elena Rodriguez had not just been a Gold Star widow who supported veteran causes. She had been a force for good in her community, someone who understood that service takes many forms and that honor is earned through daily actions rather than grand gestures. Among her papers, I found something that would change the course of my life. A folder labeled for Maria in her careful handwriting, containing documents that detailed a trust fund she had established years earlier. The money wasn't significant by military standards, but it was enough to make a difference, enough to build something lasting. Attached to the financial documents was a letter in her handwriting, dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Maria," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are probably feeling more alone than you have ever felt in your life. I know your parents don't understand your choices, and I know that my death has probably made that divide even more painful. But I want you to know that I have never been prouder of anyone in my life than I am of you. You chose to serve something bigger than yourself, just as your grandfather did and just as I tried to do in my own way. That choice comes with a cost, and I have watched you pay it with grace and dignity that reminds me why I fell in love with a soldier all those years ago. The money in this trust is not much, but it is meant to help you build something good from the pain you are feeling right now. Use it to help other veterans, other families who are struggling with the cost of service. Use it to bridge the gap between those who serve and those who don't understand that service. You are not alone, Maria. You never have." There is a family of service members and veterans in military families who understand exactly what you have sacrificed and why that sacrifice matters. Find them, help them, let them help you. Love always and with infinite pride, Grandma Elena. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Even in death, even from beyond the grave, Elena Rodriguez was teaching me about service and family and the ways that love could transcend distance and misunderstanding. As dawn broke over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I began to formulate a plan. I would use Grandma Elena's trust fund to establish something lasting, something that would honor her memory while helping other military families navigate the challenges I had faced. The idea was still rough, still taking shape in my mind, but the foundation was there. A support network for military families, a resource for veterans dealing with civilian family conflicts, a bridge between those who serve and those who struggle to understand that service. I thought about the 8 sailors who had come to honor my grandmother, about the dozens of veterans who had signed that note, about the VFW members who had somehow coordinated a show of support for someone they barely knew. These people understood something that my blood family did not, that chosen family can be every bit as meaningful as biological family, that loyalty and love are earned through actions rather than inherited through DNA. The funeral was over, the formal goodbye complete, but my relationship with Elena Rodriguez's memory was just beginning. She had given me one final gift, one last lesson about service and sacrifice and the ways that love could outlast even death itself. I packed her letter carefully in my sea bag, along with the flag that had been presented to me by Commander Thompson and the photograph that had held the place of honor on her mantle. These would travel with me wherever the Navy sent me next, reminders of where I came from and why I chose to serve. But first I had work to do in Riverside. I had a trust fund to establish, a mission to plan, and a community of veterans to connect with. I had promises to keep to a woman who had never stopped believing in me, even when I stopped believing in myself. The phone rang as I was preparing to leave for my meeting with the attorney who had handled Grandma Elena's estate. It was Daniel, his voice careful and tentative. "Maria, I heard about what happened yesterday at the cemetery, about the Navy people who came. Word travels fast in a small town. People are talking about the flag ceremony, about the honor guard, about how many veterans showed up to pay respects." He paused. "Mom and Dad are starting to realize they might have made a mistake." I felt a familiar surge of anger at the suggestion that my parents' change of heart was motivated by public opinion rather than genuine remorse. But I also heard something else in Daniel's voice, something that sounded like hope. "What are you saying, Daniel?" "I'm saying maybe it's not too late to fix this. Maybe there's a way to heal the family without anyone having to choose between duty and blood." I looked around the living room where I had spent so many childhood afternoons, where I had learned about faith and service and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. Elena Rodriguez had taught me many things, but perhaps the most important was that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing harmful behavior. Forgiveness was about refusing to let other people's choices define your own future. I'm willing to talk, I said finally, but things are going to have to change. I'm not going to apologize for serving my country, and I'm not going to pretend that what happened yesterday was acceptable. I understand, and Maria, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Grandma Elena was proud of, and I think deep down Mom and Dad are proud of you too. They just don't know how to show it. After Daniel hung up, I sat in the silence of my grandmother's house and thought about the complexity of family relationships, about the ways that love and pain could coexist in the same space. I thought about the letter Elena had left for me, about her final lesson in turning pain into purpose. Maybe there was a way to honor both my military family and my biological family. Maybe there was a way to use the support I had received from the veteran community to build bridges rather than walls. Maybe forgiveness and accountability could coexist, allowing for healing without requiring anyone to pretend that deep wounds could be instantly mended. I had learned many things during my years of service, but perhaps the most valuable was that the most difficult missions often produced the most meaningful results. Rebuilding my relationship with my parents would be one of those missions, requiring patience and strategy and a willingness to accept that some things might never be completely repaired. But for Elena Rodriguez, for the woman who had taught me that service takes many forms and that love can transcend even the deepest disappointments, I was willing to try. The meeting with attorney Margaret Walsh took place on Monday morning in her downtown Riverside office, a converted Victorian house that had been serving the legal needs of the community for nearly 40 years. Walsh had handled Grandma Elena's affairs for the past 2 decades, and her weathered face carried the kind of wisdom that comes from witnessing countless family dramas play out in conference rooms and courthouses. She greeted me with the same warmth she had shown during my childhood visits to her office with Grandma Elena, but there was something else in her expression now, a mixture of sympathy and concern that suggested she knew more about my family's situation than I had expected. "Maria, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother spoke of you often and always with such pride." She gestured toward a chair across from her massive oak desk, the same desk where I had sat as a teenager while Elena updated her will after Grandpa Miguel's death. "I assume you're here about the trust fund she established. Among other things, I'm trying to understand exactly what she intended, and I'm hoping you can help me navigate the legal requirements for what I want to do." Miss Walsh opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the desk between us. Elena was very specific about her intentions when she established this trust 3 years ago. She wanted to ensure that if something happened to her, you would have the resources to continue the kind of work she had been doing with military families. I studied the documents as she explained the detail. The trust contained more money than I had initially realized, accumulated through decades of careful saving and modest investments. But more importantly, it came with a clear mandate for how the funds should be used and specific instructions about the kind of organization Elena had envisioned. She researched similar programs around the country, Mrs. Walsh continued, pulling out a folder thick with printed articles and correspondence. Veterans Family Support Networks, programs that help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, resources for service members dealing with family conflicts related to their duty assignment. As I read through Elena's research, I began to understand the depth of thought she had put into this plan. This wasn't just about leaving me money or helping me feel better about the family conflict that had excluded me from her funeral. This was about addressing a systemic problem she had observed through her decades of involvement with the veteran community. She documented case after case of military families torn apart by misunderstanding and resentment. Miss Walsh explained, pointing to a stack of handwritten notes in Elena's careful script. Parents who couldn't understand why their children chose military service, spouses who felt abandoned during deployments, extended families who saw military duty as a choice that took precedence over family obligation. The parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore, but as I read further I realized that my experience was far from unique. Elena had collected stories from dozens of military families, documenting patterns of conflict and alienation that repeated themselves across different branches of service, different generations, different geographical regions. What exactly did she envision? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what my grandmother had apparently been planning. A foundation that would provide mediation services for military families in conflict, educational programs to help civilian family members understand the realities of military service, and direct support for service members who found themselves isolated from their families due to duty requirements. Mrs. Walsh pulled out a leather-bound notebook filled with Elena's handwriting. She called it the Bridge Project, because she believed the gap between military and civilian family members could be bridged with understanding and communication. I spent the next 2 hours reading through Elena's notes and research, amazed by the thoroughness of her planning and the clarity of her vision. She had identified potential partner organizations, researched legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit foundation, and even outlined preliminary budgets for different program components. But it was her personal observations that affected me most deep. In margin notes and separate journal entries, she had documented her own struggle to help my parents understand my choice to serve, her frustration with their inability to see military duty as anything other than abandonment, and her growing realization that education and communication might be the keys to healing family rifts that seemed insurmountable. She tried to get your parents involved in veteran support activities at the VFW, Mrs. Walsh explained when I asked about some of them. She thought that if they could meet other military families, hear other stories, they might develop a different perspective on your service. I take it that didn't work. They attended exactly one meeting. Your mother found it too painful to hear about other families' separations and deployments, and your father said he didn't see the point in dwelling on choices that couldn't be changed. The conversation with Mrs. Walsh continued through lunch and into the afternoon as we worked through the legal requirements for establishing the foundation Elena had envisioned. The process would be complex, involving federal and state paperwork, tax exemption applications, and the development of formal program structures that could withstand regulatory scrutiny. But as we talked, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced since before Elena's death. Direction. A sense that the pain and isolation of the past week could be transformed into something meaningful and lasting. There's one more thing, Mrs. Walsh said as our meeting was winding down. Elena left specific instructions about how she wanted the foundation launched. She wanted it announced at a community meeting, with representatives from all the veteran organizations in the area, civilian community leaders, and local media coverage. I felt my stomach tighten at the thought of such public exposure. Miss Walsh, given what happened with my family and the funeral, I'm not sure a public announcement is the best approach. Maybe something quieter, more low-key. That's exactly what Elena anticipated you would say. She smiled and pulled out one final document, this one sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only if Maria objects to public announcement. She handed it to me with the same ceremonial gravity she had shown when reading Elena's will. Inside was another letter in my grandmother's handwriting, this one shorter but no less direct than the one I had found at her house. My dearest Maria, if you are reading this, then Margaret has told you about the community announcement I requested, and you have objected because you are afraid of more public conflict with your parents. I understand that fear, but I need you to understand something important. The work we are starting together is bigger than our family's problems. There are hundreds of military families in this community who need what we can offer them, and they deserve to know that help is available. Don't let fear of embarrassment prevent you from serving others the way you have served your country. Trust in the community that honored you at my funeral. Trust in the people who understand that service requires sacrifice and that sacrifice deserves respect. Most importantly, trust in yourself and in the mission we are undertaking together. You have never been one to back down from a challenge, and this is not the time to start. With love and confidence in your courage, Grandma Elena. I read the letter twice before looking up at Miss Walsh, who was watching me with an expression that suggested she had read it herself and was waiting to see how I would respond. She knew me pretty well, I said finally. She did indeed. So what do you want to do about the announcement? I thought about the 8 Navy personnel who had traveled hundreds of miles to honor Elena and support me during the funeral. I thought about the dozens of veterans who had left flowers and notes at her grave, acknowledging both her service to the community and my service to the country. I thought about the VFW members who had coordinated that show of support without even knowing me personally. Most importantly, I thought about Elena's final lesson about turning pain into purpose, about refusing to let other people's limitations define your own potential for service. Let's schedule the announcement, I said. But I want to do it right. I want representatives from every veteran organization in the county, every military family support group, local government officials, and yes, media coverage. If we're going to launch the Bridge Project, we're going to do it in a way that honors Elena's vision and reaches everyone who might benefit from what we're offering. Mrs. Walsh smiled with genuine warmth. I think Elena would be very proud of that decision. The announcement was scheduled for the following Saturday evening at Riverside Community Center, the same building where Elena had organized countless fundraisers and volunteer events over the years. Word spread quickly through both the veteran community and the general population, helped along by an article in the Riverside Herald that described the foundation as a final gift from a Gold Star widow who spent her life building bridges between military and civilian community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Wednesday, Mrs. Walsh was receiving calls from military families throughout the region who wanted to learn more about the services the bridge project would offer. Local businesses volunteered to sponsor the launch event. Veteran organizations offered to provide honor guards and ceremonial support, and several state legislators confirmed their attendance. But it was the personal calls that affected me most deeply. Service members from different branches of the military reached out to share their own stories of family conflict and alienation, describing situations that mirrored my own experience in painful detail. A Marine corporal whose parents had disowned him after his third deployment to Afghanistan. An Air Force captain whose in-laws refused to attend her children's birthday parties because they disapproved of her military career. A Navy commander whose siblings had excluded him from family gatherings for so many years that his own children didn't recognize their cousin. Each story reinforced Elena's observation that family conflict related to military service was a widespread problem that deserved systematic attention and professional intervention. These were not isolated cases of family dysfunction, but patterns of misunderstanding that could be addressed through education, communication, and structured support. I spent the week before the announcement working with representatives from VFW Post 45 the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and several other military organizations to develop a preliminary program structure for the bridge project. The meetings took place in the same community center where we would hold the launch event, and I was struck by the enthusiasm and expertise that these veterans brought to the planning process. Chief among them was Harold Hank Morrison, a Vietnam veteran who had served as Elena's liaison to the VFW for more than a decade. Hank was a compact man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of some of my favorite senior non-commissioned officers. Elena talked about this project for years, he told me during our first planning meeting. She saw what was happening with military families, saw how many good people were being torn apart by things that could be fixed with the right kind of help. Hank had brought with him a team of volunteers that included retired military personnel, spouses of active duty service members, and several civilian community leaders who had worked with Elena on other projects. Together, we outlined a three-pronged approach to the family conflict issues the bridge project would address. First, direct mediation services for families in crisis, utilizing trained counselors who understood the unique stresses and demands of military life. Second, educational programs for civilian family members that would help them understand deployment cycles, military culture, and the psychological impact of service on their loved one. Third, support groups for service members who felt isolated from their families, providing peer counseling and practical advice for maintaining relationships across distance and cultural divides. The key, explained Sarah Kim, a family therapist and military spouse who had volunteered to help design the counseling protocols, is helping both sides understand that military service affects the entire family system, not just the person wearing the uniform. Civilian family members need support and education, but service members also need to learn how to maintain family connections while meeting their professional obligations. As the week progressed and our planning became more detailed, I found myself energized in a way I hadn't experienced since my early days in the Navy. This work felt important, meaningful, connected to something larger than individual advancement or personal achievement. But I was also aware that the public announcement would likely force a confrontation with my parents that had been building since the day of Elena's funeral. The media coverage alone would make it impossible for them to continue pretending that the family conflict didn't exist, and I had no idea how they would respond to the public attention. That question was answered on Friday evening when I received a phone call from Daniel. His voice was tense, strained in a way that suggested he was calling against his better judgment. "Maria, we need to talk, all of us, before tomorrow's announcement. Is that what Mom and Dad want, or what you want? It's what needs to happen. This thing has gone too far, gotten too public. People in town are talking about our family, about what happened at the funeral, about how you were treated. Mom and Dad are embarrassed, and they're angry, and they think you're trying to humiliate them on purpose." I felt the familiar surge of frustration at the suggestion that my actions were motivated by revenge rather than purpose. "Daniel, this isn't about them. This is about honoring Grandma Elena's vision, and helping other military families who are going through what we've been going through. I know that, Jessica knows that, But mom and dad see it as you making a public statement about how badly they treated you, and they think tomorrow's announcement is going to be some kind of public rebuke of their parenting. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel trying to broker some kind of peace agreement that would prevent further public embarrassment for our parents while allowing me to proceed with the foundation launch. But as we talked, I realized that any attempt to compromise would require me to downplay the family conflict that had inspired Elena's vision for the bridge project. "Tell me something, Daniel," I said finally. "Do you think they were wrong to ban me from the funeral?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Yes, I think they were wrong. I think they were hurt and angry, and they made a decision based on emotion rather than logic. But I also think they're not bad people, and I think they deserve a chance to make this right." "What kind of chance?" "Come to dinner tomorrow before the announcement. Let them apologize. Let them be part of what you're doing instead of fighting against it." I considered the proposal carefully, thinking about Elena's letters and her emphasis on forgiveness and bridge building. But I also thought about the humiliation of being escorted away from the church, the loneliness of watching her funeral from a distant hill, and the casual cruelty of being excluded from saying goodbye to the woman who had shaped so much of who I had become. "I'll come to dinner," I said finally, "but I need you to understand something. I'm not going to apologize for serving my country, and I'm not going to pretend that what happened last week was acceptable. If they want to be part of what I'm doing with the bridge project, they're going to have to acknowledge that military families deserve better than what they gave me." "Fair enough. Dinner is at 6. The announcement starts at 7:30. That should give us enough time to work things out." After I hung up, I sat in Elena's living room surrounded by the planning documents and correspondence that had consumed my week. Tomorrow would mark the public launch of her final project, the culmination of years of planning and research aimed at helping military families navigate the exact kind of conflict that had torn our own family apart. But first, I would have to navigate one more family dinner, one more attempt to bridge the gap between duty and blood that had caused so much pain over the years. The outcome of that conversation would determine not just the future of my relationship with my parents, but the tone and direction of the Bridge Project's work in our community. I spent Friday evening reading through the stories that military families had shared with me during the week, preparing myself for the possibility that my parents would remain unable or unwilling to understand the importance of the work Elena had envisioned. But I also prepared for the possibility that they might surprise me, that grief and public scrutiny might have opened their hearts to perspectives they had previously rejected. Either way, I was ready. Elena had taught me that bridge building required patience, persistence, and a willingness to remain committed to the process even when the outcome remained uncertain. Tomorrow would be a test of those lessons, both in my personal relationships and in the public work I was about to undertake. The morning of the announcement dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Ohio beautiful in October. I dressed carefully in my navy dress blues, the same uniform I had worn to Elena's funeral, the same uniform that had become a symbol of both pride and division in my family. But this time I wasn't wearing it in isolation or from a distance. This time I would be surrounded by people who understood what it represented, who honored the choice it symbolized, and who were committed to helping other families navigate the complex emotions that military service could provoke. I spent the morning reviewing my remarks for the evening announcement, checking and rechecking the logistics for the event, and trying to manage the butterflies that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. This was different from any mission briefing or combat preparation I had ever experienced. This was personal, emotional, connected to relationships and expectations that couldn't be managed through military training or professional protocol. At 5:30, I drove to my parents' house for what might be our last conversation as a family, or the first step toward rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and mutual disappointment. The porch light was on when I pulled into the driveway, and I could see Daniel's car parked beside my father's truck. Through the kitchen window, I could make out figures moving around the table where we had shared countless meals during my childhood, where Elena had taught me to cook traditional recipes, where family arguments and celebrations had played out over the course of decades. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage and thinking about Elena's final letters, her emphasis on forgiveness without forgetting, on bridge building without compromise of principle. Then I walked up the front steps and knocked on the door of the house where I had been born, where I had learned about family and loyalty, and the sometimes painful cost of following your own path. Daniel answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I knew immediately that the conversation ahead would be every bit as difficult as I had anticipated. "Ready for this?" he asked quietly. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, and stepped inside to face whatever came next. The kitchen smelled like roast beef and fresh bread, the same combination of aromas that had welcomed me home from school every day during my childhood. My mother had set the table with her good china, the delicate blue and white pattern that only appeared for special occasions and important conversations. The gesture was both touching and ominous, suggesting that this dinner carried weight beyond ordinary family reconciliation. My father sat at the head of the table, his hands folded carefully in front of him, wearing the same expression he had worn during my high school disciplinary meetings and college financial discussions. Patricia sat to his right, her eyes red-rimmed but determined, clutching a tissue that had been twisted into a tight ball. Daniel and Jessica flanked the other side, their faces carefully neutral but their posture tense with anticipation. Maria. My father's voice was formal. Thank you for coming. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the same chair I had occupied during countless family dinners, holiday celebrations, and awkward conversations about grades and boyfriends and career plans. But this felt different, charged with years of accumulated disappointment and misunderstanding. I brought something for you, my mother said suddenly, reaching beside her chair to produce a small wrapped package. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it in front of me. I should have given this to you at the funeral, but I wasn't thinking clearly. Inside the tissue paper was Elena's rosary, the worn wooden beads she had carried to Mass every Sunday for 60 years. The crucifix was tarnished silver, etched with tiny flowers that had been polished smooth by decades of prayer and meditation. I had watched Elena use these beads countless times during my childhood, her lips moving silently through familiar prayers during difficult moments. She wanted you to have it, my mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me specifically, last month when she was still in the hospital, she said you would need something to hold on to when things got difficult. I wrapped my fingers around the smooth beads, feeling the weight of devotion and faith they represented. Thank you for bringing this to me. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes while my mother served the meal, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topics that had brought us together. The roast beef was perfectly cooked, the mashed potatoes creamy and seasoned exactly the way Elena had taught my mother to prepare them. Under different circumstances, this would have been a pleasant family dinner, the kind of gathering I had missed during so many deployments. Finally, my father cleared his throat and spoke. Maria, we owe you an apology. The words hung in the air between us, unexpected and insufficient at the same time. I waited for him to continue, to explain what exactly he was apologizing for and whether this represented genuine remorse or simply embarrassment about public perception. We were wrong to exclude you from your grandmother's funeral. We were grieving and we were angry, and we made decisions based on emotion rather than reason. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. We never intended to hurt you the way we did. My mother leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We blamed you for not being here when she died, but that wasn't fair. We knew you were deployed. We knew you couldn't just leave your duties because we wanted you home. Then why did you do it? The question came out sharper than I had intended, but I needed to understand the reasoning behind decisions that had cut so deeply. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair before answering. Because they were scared. Because they didn't know how to process losing Grandma Elena, and they needed someone to blame for all the pain they were feeling. That's not entirely fair to your mother and me, my father interjected. The truth is more complicated than that. He set down his fork and looked directly at me for the first time since I had arrived. Maria, do you have any idea how hard it's been to watch you choose the military over family for 12 years? Do you understand what it's like to have neighbors ask why our daughter can't come home for Christmas, or Easter, or important family events? I felt my defensive instincts rising, the familiar anger that accompanied any criticism of my military service. Dad, I didn't choose the military over family. I chose to serve my country, and that service required sacrifices from all of us. But it didn't require sacrifices from all of us equally, my mother said quietly. You got to travel the world, to have adventures, to be part of something important and meaningful. We got to stay home and explain to people why you weren't there for weddings and graduations and family celebrations. The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth I had tried not to examine too closely. My military service had taken me to places my parents would never see, had given me experiences they couldn't understand, had connected me to a community of people who shared values and commitments that my family found foreign. I never meant for my service to hurt you, I said carefully. I thought you understood that I was doing something important, something that mattered. We did understand that, my father replied. But understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. When Elena got sick, when she started asking for you every day, it brought up all the years of missed occasions and empty chairs at family dinners. Jessica spoke for the first time since I had arrived, her voice gentle but direct. They're not saying your service wasn't important, Maria. They're saying it was painful to be the ones left behind. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. These weren't people who opposed military service on principle or who failed to appreciate the importance of national defense. These were people who had paid their own price for my commitment to duty, who had felt abandoned and forgotten while I was protecting strangers in distant countries. I wish you had told me how you felt, I said finally. I wish we could have talked about this before it became such a source of resentment. Would it have changed anything? My mother asked. If we had told you how much we missed you, how much it hurt when you volunteered for deployments that took you even farther away, would you have made different choices? The question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding since Elena's death. Would I have chosen differently if I had fully understood the cost my family was paying? Would I have declined deployments or refused promotions that required extended absences if I had known how deeply my parents were suffering? I don't know, I answered honestly. I hope I would have found a way to serve my country while staying more connected to my family. But I can't go back and change the choices I made. We know that, my father said, and we don't want to change who you've become, or diminish what you've accomplished. We're proud of your service, Maria. We're proud of the woman you've become. We just wish it hadn't cost us so much time together. Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. The question now is whether we can move forward from here, whether we can find a way to be a family that includes your military career instead of being divided by it. I thought about Elena's letters, about her emphasis on forgiveness and bridge building, about her vision for helping other military families navigate exactly these kinds of conflicts. Looking at my parents across the dinner table, I could see the pain and regret in their faces. But I could also see genuine love and a desire to repair what had been damaged. There's something I need you to understand, I said slowly. The work I'm doing with the Bridge Project, the foundation that Grandma Elena planned, it's not about getting revenge or embarrassing anyone. It's about helping other families avoid the kind of pain we've all experienced. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. Tell us about it. Help us understand what Elena was trying to accomplish. I spent the next 30 minutes explaining the research Elena had conducted, the stories she had collected from other military families, and the three-pronged approach we had developed for addressing family conflicts related to military service. As I talked, I watched my parents' expressions change from defensive to curious, to genuinely interested. So this isn't just about our family problems, my father said when I finished. This is about a systematic issue that affects military families everywhere. Exactly. And Elena believed that education and communication could help bridge the gap between military and civilian family members. She thought that if people understood the realities of military service, the pressures and demands and psychological costs, they might be more supportive of their family members who choose to serve. Jessica pulled out a notebook and began taking notes. What kind of educational programs are you planning? I outlined the workshops we were developing for civilian family members, the support groups for service members dealing with family conflicts, and the mediation services for families in crisis. As I explained each component, I could see my family beginning to understand the scope and importance of what we were trying to accomplish. This sounds like something that could really help people, my mother said thoughtfully. How can we be involved? The question caught me off guard. I had come to dinner expecting continued conflict, prepared for either grudging acceptance or outright opposition to the Bridge Project. I hadn't anticipated genuine interest or offers of support. You want to be involved. Elena was part of this family too, my father said firmly. If this was her vision, if this was what she wanted her legacy to be, then we want to be part of making it happen. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. Jessica has a background in social work, and she's been looking for ways to get more involved in veteran support activity. This sounds like exactly the kind of program she could contribute to. As we continued talking, I began to see a path forward that I hadn't imagined when I walked through the front door an hour earlier. My parents' opposition to my military service hadn't been rooted in lack of patriotism or failure to appreciate the importance of national defense. It had been rooted in personal pain, in the very real cost that military families pay when one member chooses to serve. But that pain, properly channeled, could become a source of insight and empathy for other families struggling with similar conflicts. My parents understood the civilian perspective in ways that I, as a service member, could never fully grasp. Their experience of being left behind, of feeling abandoned by military duty requirements, was exactly the perspective the Bridge Project needed to serve both sides of family conflicts effectively. There's one thing I need you to understand, I said as our conversation began to wind down. I'm not going to apologize for my military service, and I'm not going to pretend that what happened at Grandma Elena's funeral was acceptable. If we're going to move forward as a family, it has to be with honest acknowledgement of what went wrong and genuine commitment to doing better. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We know what we did was wrong, Maria. We know we hurt you in ways that can't be easily repaired. But we want to try to make things right, if you'll let us. We want to be the kind of family that Elena would have been proud of. My father, the kind of family that supports military service instead of resenting it. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, seeing possibility where I had expected only continued conflict. The conversation hadn't magically erased years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding, but it had opened a door that I had thought was permanently closed. All right, I said finally. Let's try to move forward, but I need you to understand that trust is rebuilt through actions, not just words. If you want to be part of the Bridge Project, if you want to help other military families, you're going to have to demonstrate that you truly understand and support what we're trying to accomplish. The remainder of dinner passed quickly, as we discussed practical matters related to the evening's announcement, and the role my family might play in the Bridge Project's future activity. By the time we finished eating, the conversation had shifted from painful confrontation to collaborative planning, from defensive positions to shared purpose. As I prepared to leave for the community center, my mother handed me another small package. This was also Elena's, she said softly. She wanted you to wear it tonight. Inside was a small American flag pin, the kind that veterans wore on their lapels during patriotic occasions. But this one was special, engraved with the words Gold Star Wife and dated 1953, the year Grandpa Miguel had been killed in Korea. She wore this to every veteran event she attended for 60 years, my mother explained. She wanted you to have it, to carry on the tradition of honoring military service in our family. I pinned the flag to my dress blue jacket, feeling the weight of Elena's legacy and the responsibility it carried. This evening's announcement would mark not just the public launch of the Bridge Project, but the beginning of a new chapter in my family's relationship with military service. The drive to Riverside Community Center took only 10 minutes, but it felt like a journey between two different worlds. I was leaving behind the kitchen table where my family had finally begun to confront years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding, heading toward a public event where Elena's vision for healing military family conflicts would be shared with the entire community. The parking lot was already crowded when I arrived, filled with cars bearing military decals, veteran organization stickers, and license plates from multiple states. Word about the Bridge Project announcement had spread far beyond Riverside, drawing military families from throughout the region who were curious about the services we planned to offer. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and purpose. Veteran organization representatives had set up information tables along the walls, displaying brochures and banners that represented every branch of military service. Local media representatives were testing cameras and microphones, preparing to document the evening's proceedings for the wider community. But it was the people who filled the folding chairs that impressed me most. Military families of all ages and backgrounds, from young couples dealing with their first deployment, to elderly veterans who had served in conflicts spanning multiple decades. Civilian community leaders who wanted to better understand how to support military families in their neighborhood. Current service members who had driven hours to learn about resources that might help them navigate their own family conflicts. Hank Morrison approached me as I surveyed the crowd, his weathered face bright with satisfaction. Elena would be so proud of this turnout, he said quietly. She always believed that if you brought people together around a common purpose, amazing things could happen. I spotted my family entering through the main doors, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the size and diversity of the crowd. Daniel and Jessica immediately began introducing themselves to other attendees, while my parents stood uncertainly near the entrance, apparently unsure about their role in the evening's proceedings. Sarah Kim, the family therapist who had helped design our counseling protocols, joined Hank and me near the front of the room. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, gesturing toward the microphone that had been set up for the formal presentation. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, echoing the words I had spoken to Daniel earlier that evening. But this time I felt the truth of that readiness, grounded in Elena's vision, supported by a community of people who understood the importance of what we were trying to accomplish. At exactly 7:30, Hank stepped to the microphone and called the meeting to order. The conversation in the room gradually subsided as people settled into their chairs and turned their attention toward the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening for the official launch of the Bridge Project, a new foundation dedicated to supporting military families in conflict. His voice carried clearly through the room, reaching even the people standing along the back wall. This foundation represents the final vision of Elena Rodriguez, a Gold Star widow who spent 60 years supporting military families in our community. He gestured toward a large photograph of Elena that had been placed on an easel beside the podium, showing her as she had appeared during her later years, wearing the same American flag pin that now adorned my jacket. Elena understood that military service affects entire families, not just the people wearing uniforms. She saw how misunderstanding and lack of communication could tear families apart, and she dedicated the final years of her life to developing solutions for those conflicts. Hank went on to outline Elena's research and planning, explaining how she had identified patterns of family discord that repeated across different military communities and different generations of service members. He described her vision for education, mediation, and support services that could help bridge the gap between military and civilian family members. Tonight, we're here to announce the official launch of the Bridge Project and to introduce you to the person Elena chose to carry forward her vision. He turned toward me with a smile. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, United States Navy, Elena's granddaughter and the founding director of the Bridge Project. The applause as I approached the microphone was immediate and sustained, a wave of support that seemed to encompass not just my military service but the work Elena and I were undertaking together. I could see faces throughout the crowd, some familiar from the veteran community, others completely new but united in their understanding of military family challenges. "Thank you," I said when the applause finally subsided. "Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for supporting the vision that my grandmother Elena Rodriguez spent her final years developing." I looked out at the crowd, seeing military families who had driven hours to attend, community leaders who wanted to learn how to better support their military neighbors, and my own family members who were beginning to understand their role in Elena's larger purpose. The Bridge Project exists because military families face unique challenges that civilian families often don't understand. We exist because deployment cycles, military culture, and the demands of national service can create distances that seem impossible to bridge. We exist because Elena Rodriguez believed that love and understanding could overcome even the deepest family conflicts. As I continued speaking, outlining the specific services the Bridge Project would offer and the ways that people could get involved, I felt Elena's presence in the room, not in any supernatural sense but in the shared commitment to service and family that had brought so many people together on a Saturday evening in October. When I finished my prepared remarks and opened the floor for questions, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Military spouses wanted to know about support groups for families dealing with extended deployments. Veterans asked about mediation services for conflicts that had been festering for years. Civilian parents of service members requested information about educational workshops that could help them better understand their children's military experience. Each question reinforced Elena's observation that family conflicts related to military service were widespread and systematic, affecting communities throughout the country in ways that deserved professional attention and structured solution. But it was the final question of the evening that brought everything into focus. An elderly woman near the back of the room stood slowly and asked, "How do we know this program will really work? How do we know that education and communication can actually heal family conflicts that have been going on for years?" Before I could respond, my father surprised everyone by standing up from his seat in the middle of the room. The community center fell silent as people recognized him from the newspaper coverage of Elena's funeral and the family conflicts that had surrounded it. "Ma'am, I can answer that question," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. 3 hours ago, my wife and I were still angry and resentful about our daughter's military service. We blamed her for choosing duty over family, for missing important events, for not being there when we needed her most. He paused, looking directly at me before continuing. But tonight, after listening to Maria explain the Bridge Project and understanding the scope of what Elena was trying to accomplish, we realized that our conflict wasn't really about military service. It was about fear and misunderstanding and our own inability to see beyond our personal pain. My mother stood beside him, her voice trembling but determined. "This program works because it's already working for our family. It's helping us understand that supporting military service means accepting the sacrifices that come with it, and it's teaching us that love can be stronger than distance or duty requirements." The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition I had received early. This was personal, emotional, a celebration of healing and possibility that seemed to energize everyone in the room. As the formal meeting concluded and people began gathering around the information tables and networking with other attendees, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Elena's death: hope. Not just hope for the bridge project's success, but hope for my family's future. Hope for the hundreds of military families who would benefit from Elena's vision, and hope for the kind of community support that could make military service a source of pride rather than division. My parents approached me as the crowd began to thin, their faces reflecting the same mixture of exhaustion and possibility that I was feeling. "We're proud of you, Maria," my father said simply. "We're proud of your service, and we're proud of what you're doing to honor Elena's memory." My mother handed me one final envelope. "This is from Elena too. She said to give it to you after the first bridge project meeting, after you had begun the work she envisioned." Inside was a photograph I had never seen before, taken during my promotion ceremony 2 years early. But this wasn't the formal portrait I had sent to Elena. This was a candid shot of me laughing with fellow service members after the ceremony, my face bright with joy and camaraderie. On the back in Elena's handwriting were the words that would guide the bridge project for years to come. "Family is not just about blood or geography. Family is about the people who support your dreams, who honor your choices, and who love you enough to grow beyond their own fear. You have found that family in the military, Maria. Now help others find it too." As I stood in the emptying community center, surrounded by the people who had committed to supporting Elena's vision, I realized that the bridge project was already succeeding in ways we hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just helping military families resolve conflicts. It was creating new definitions of family, new communities of support, and new possibilities for understanding between people who had previously seemed impossibly divided. The evening that had begun with a difficult family dinner had ended with the birth of something larger and more meaningful than any of us had imagined. Elena's final gift wasn't just a foundation for helping military families. It was a demonstration that love, properly understood and carefully nurtured, could indeed bridge any distance and heal any wound. 6 months after the bridge project's launch, I stood once again at Elena's grave, but this time I wasn't alone. My parents flanked me on either side, each carrying flowers from the garden Elena had taught us all to tend during childhood summers. The headstone was finally in place, simple granite engraved with her name, dates, and the words "Gold Star Wife, Devoted Mother, Bridge Builder." The morning was crisp with the promise of spring, and Riverside Cemetery was beginning to show signs of new life after a long winter. But it wasn't just the changing season that made this visit different from all the others. It was the knowledge that Elena's vision had taken root and was growing in ways none of us had imagined possible. The bridge project served its 100th family last week, I told Elena's headstone, the same way I had shared news with her during all those years of deployment letters. "Doc Kim says we're already seeing patterns that confirm your research about communication and education being the keys to family healing." My father knelt beside the grave to arrange the roses he had brought, the same deep red variety that Elena had grown along her back fence for 30 years. "We've been volunteering at the family education workshops," he said quietly. "Patricia and we've been sharing our story with other civilian parents who are struggling to understand their children's military service." It was still strange to hear my parents talk openly about their involvement with veteran support activities, but they had thrown themselves into the bridge project with the same intensity they had once directed toward opposing my military career. My mother had become particularly effective at leading support groups for military family members who felt abandoned by deployment schedules and duty requirements. Miss Patterson from 3 houses down attended one of Mom's workshops last month, I continued, speaking to Elena as if she were still sitting on her front porch, listening with patient attention. Her grandson deployed to Germany, and she was struggling with feeling forgotten and unimportant. Mom helped her understand that supporting military service means accepting the temporary sacrifices it requires. The success stories had been accumulating steadily since the bridge project's launch, each one confirming Elena's belief that family conflicts related to military service could be resolved through structured intervention and education. But it was the personal transformation within my own family that continued to amaze me most. My parents had not only apologized for their treatment during Elena's funeral, they had become advocates for military families throughout the region. They spoke at veteran events, hosted bridge project fundraisers, and worked tirelessly to help other families avoid the pain and misunderstanding that had divided us for so many years. Daniel and Jessica are expanding the program to 3 neighboring counties, my mother added, placing a small American flag beside the headstone. The demand has been so overwhelming that we're already planning a second full-time staff position. The growth of the bridge project had exceeded every projection we had made during those initial planning meetings at the community center. Word had spread through military networks and veteran organizations, generating requests for services from families throughout Ohio and beyond. We were fielding calls from military communities in other states who wanted to establish their own bridge project chapter. But success had also brought unexpected challenges and responsibilities that Elena couldn't have anticipated when she first outlined her vision for healing military family conflicts. The biggest challenge had come from within my own military career. The publicity surrounding the bridge project, while overwhelmingly positive, had attracted attention from Navy leadership who questioned whether my civilian advocacy activities were appropriate for an active duty service member. The conversation with my commanding officer had been tense and uncertain, forcing me to consider whether continuing my military career was compatible with the work Elena had envisioned for the bridge project. Commander Thompson called it the most professional example of community service he had seen from a junior officer, I told Elena, remembering the relief I had felt when my CO had not only approved my continued involvement, but had recommended me for a commendation based on the bridge project's impact on military family welfare. The Navy's official endorsement had opened doors we hadn't expected, leading to partnerships with military family life coordinators, chaplain services, and base community support programs. The bridge project was becoming part of the official military family support network rather than simply a civilian advocacy organization. As we stood in the quiet cemetery, I reflected on how much had changed since that October morning when Daniel's phone call had shattered my world with news of Elena's death. The pain and isolation I had felt during those dark days seemed almost like memories from someone else's life. My relationship with my parents had evolved from mutual resentment to genuine partnership in service of something larger than our individual grievances. We had learned to see each other not as sources of disappointment, but as resources for understanding different perspectives on military service and its impact on family relationships. We got a letter from that Marine corporal in California, my father said, pulling a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. The one whose parents disowned him after his third deployment. He and his family completed the mediation program, and they're planning their first Christmas together in 5 years. These letters had become a regular part of our bridge project work, updates from military families who were rebuilding relationships that had seemed permanently damaged by misunderstanding and resentment. Each success story reinforced Elena's fundamental insight that family conflicts related to military service were not insurmountable obstacles but communication problems that could be addressed through education and structured support. But it was the failures that haunted me most, the families who completed our programs without achieving reconciliation, the service members who remained isolated from blood relatives who could never accept their commitment to duty over family convenience. Not every story has a happy ending, I said to Elena, voicing a concern that had been weighing on me since the bridge project's early successes had given way to more complex and challenging cases. Some families are too broken, too set in their patterns of resentment and blame. Some military personnel have been hurt too deeply to trust that civilian family members can change. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. Elena knew that too. She never expected the bridge project to save every family. She just wanted to make sure that families who could be saved had access to the help they needed. The wisdom in those words reflected how much my mother had grown during her involvement with the bridge project, how her own experience of alienation and reconciliation had prepared her to counsel other families facing similar challenges. We spent another hour at Elena's grave, sharing updates about the bridge project's activities and discussing plans for expanding services to meet growing demand. But as we prepared to leave, I realized that these visits had become less about reporting to Elena and more about honoring her memory through continued commitment to the work she had envisioned. The drive back to town took us past the VFW post where Elena had volunteered for so many years, past the community center where we had launched the bridge project, past the church where she had worshipped and where I had been excluded from her funeral. Each landmark carried different emotional weight now, transformed from symbols of division and pain into reminders of healing and possibility. At my parents' house, we gathered around the kitchen table for Sunday dinner, a tradition that had resumed after years of missed meals and empty chairs. Daniel and Jessica joined us with their children, who had finally met their Aunt Maria and were fascinated by stories of her military adventures. "Tell us about the submarine again," 8-year-old Carlos requested, his eyes bright with excitement about the underwater world his aunt had described during previous visits. As I launched into a simplified version of submarine operations, I caught my mother's eye across the table. She was smiling with genuine warmth, no longer seeing my military experiences as evidence of abandonment, but as adventures worth celebrating and sharing with the next generation. After dinner, my father pulled me aside for a private conversation in the living room where Elena's photograph still held the place of honor on the mantle. "Maria, there's something your mother and I have been discussing. Something we want to ask you about the bridge project." I settled into Elena's favorite chair, the same spot where she had listened to my childhood dreams and adult concerns with equal attention and wisdom. "We want to establish a permanent endowment in Elena's name, something that will ensure the bridge project continues even after we're all gone." He handed me a folder containing financial documents and legal paperwork. "We've been working with Mrs. Walsh to set up a fund that would provide ongoing support for the program." The documents outlined a substantial financial commitment that would require my parents to restructure their retirement planning and make significant personal sacrifices. "Dad, this is incredibly generous, but you don't need to do this. The bridge project is already sustainable through grants and donations. We're not doing this because the program needs it," my mother said, joining us in the living room. "We're doing it because we need to do it. Because we need to make amends for the years we spent resenting your service instead of supporting it." The conversation continued for another hour as they explained their vision for the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Fund, which would not only support the bridge project's ongoing operations, but would also provide scholarships for military family members pursuing education in counseling, social work, and conflict resolution. Elena believed that healing military family relationships required professional training and systematic intervention, my father explained. This endowment would ensure that future generations of counselors and mediators receive the specialized training they need to serve military families effectively. As I reviewed the detailed plans they had developed, I was struck by how thoroughly they had embraced not just the bridge project's mission, but Elena's broader vision for addressing military family conflicts as a social issue, deserving professional attention and community support. The following week brought news that would transform the bridge project from a regional program into a national model for military family support. The Department of Defense had selected our program as one of 5 pilot projects for a new initiative aimed at reducing family-related stress factors that contributed to military retention problems. The call came from a Pentagon liaison officer, who had been following the bridge project's development through reports from base family support coordinators who had partnered with our program. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the Secretary of Defense has personally reviewed your program model and wants to discuss expanding bridge project services to military installations nationwide." The opportunity was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming, offering the chance to help thousands of military families while requiring organizational growth and professional responsibilities that would change the fundamental character of Elena's grassroots vision. I spent that evening walking through Riverside's quiet neighborhoods, past the houses where I had grown up, past the places where Elena had taught me about service and sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. At the small park where she used to take me to feed ducks during childhood summers, I sat on the same bench where we had discussed my decision to enlist, where she had supported my dreams even when they diverged from family expectation. "What would you want me to do?" I asked the empty air, hoping for some sign or insight that would guide my decision about the Pentagon's offer. The answer came not through supernatural inspiration, but through remembering Elena's consistent message throughout my life, that service takes many forms, that love requires sacrifice, and that the most important work is often the hardest work. The next morning, I called the Pentagon liaison and accepted the Department of Defense partnership, knowing that Elena would have urged me to choose the path that could help the most people, even if it required personal sacrifices and professional risk. Within 6 months, bridge project programs were operating at military installations in 12 states, serving hundreds of military families and training civilian counselors in the specialized skills needed to address military family conflicts effectively. The success exceeded every measure we had established for program effectiveness, but it also required me to make the most difficult professional decision of my military career. After 14 years of active duty service, I submitted my resignation from the Navy to become the full-time director of the Bridge Project, choosing civilian leadership of a growing organization over continued military advancement. The decision was painful but inevitable, reflecting Elena's lesson that sometimes the greatest service requires leaving behind familiar roles and comfortable identities to embrace new challenges and responsibilities. My retirement ceremony took place at Naval Station Great Lakes on a warm June morning, with my parents, Daniel, Jessica, and their children in attendance. Commander Thompson presented me with the flag that had flown over the base in honor of my service, folded in the same triangle configuration that had become so meaningful during Elena's funeral and the Navy Honor Guard's tribute. But it was the unofficial ceremony afterward that captured the true meaning of my transition from active duty to civilian service. 8 Navy personnel, including several who had attended Elena's graveside honor ceremony, formed an honor guard as I walked from the base administration building to the parking lot where my family waited. Chief Petty Officer Lisa Chen stepped forward and rendered a final salute. "Thank you for your service, Maria, both your military service and your continued service to military family." As I drove away from the naval station for the last time as an active duty service member, I felt the same mixture of loss and anticipation that had accompanied every major transition in my adult life. But this transition was different because it was grounded in Elena's vision, and supported by a community of people who understood that service takes many forms and that the most important battles are sometimes fought far from traditional battlefield. 2 years later, the Bridge Project had become a national organization with programs in 37 states and partnerships with every branch of military service. We had helped more than 2,000 military families resolve conflicts related to deployment stress, family expectations, and civilian-military cultural differences. The program had evolved beyond Elena's original vision in some ways, incorporating research partnerships with universities, policy advocacy with government agencies, and professional training programs for military family counselors. But at its core, the Bridge Project remained true to Elena's fundamental insight that military families deserved specialized support for the unique challenges they faced, and that love could overcome even the deepest misunderstandings when people were willing to listen, learn. On the second anniversary of Elena's death, I returned to Riverside Cemetery with flowers from the garden she had taught me to tend and a letter from a military family in Hawaii whose reconciliation had been facilitated by Bridge Project Mediation Service. "We've kept our promise," I told her headstone, speaking aloud in the quiet morning air. "We're building bridges between military and civilian family members, just like you envisioned. We're helping people understand that service and family can coexist, that distance doesn't diminish love, and that sacrifice has meaning when it serves something larger than individual comfort." The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, and I felt Elena's presence not as supernatural visitation, but as continued inspiration for work that had grown beyond anything either of us had imagined possible. As I walked back to my car, I noticed another visitor approaching Elena's grave, a young woman in military dress uniform carrying flowers and wearing the same expression of loss and determination I remembered from my own early visit. I approached her quietly, recognizing something familiar in her posture and demeanor. "Excuse me, are you here to visit Elena Rodriguez?" She looked up with surprise, wiping tears from her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Petty Officer Second Class Martinez. Miss Rodriguez helped my family through the Bridge Project last year when my parents were struggling with my deployment schedule. I wanted to pay my respects and let her know that my family is doing much better now." As we stood together at Elena's grave, I realized that this was how the Bridge Project would ultimately measure its success, not through statistical reports or program evaluations, but through the individual military families who found healing and understanding through Elena's vision of communication, education, and love. "She would be proud to know that her work is still helping families," I told Petty Officer Martin. "She would be proud to know that military service members like you understand that family and duty can support each other rather than compete with each other." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside, past the places where Elena had taught me about service and sacrifice, I thought about the journey that had brought us all to this point. From the devastating exclusion from her funeral to the creation of a national organization serving thousands of military families, the Bridge Project had become Elena's living legacy and proof that love, properly understood and carefully nurtured, could indeed bridge any distance. The work would continue, the families would be served, and the bridges would be built. Elena's vision had taken root and was growing in ways that honored both her memory and the military families who deserved better than the pain and division that had once characterized our own family relationships. That evening, as I sat on the front porch of Elena's house, which had become the Bridge Project's regional headquarters, I opened my laptop to respond to emails from military families seeking help, from volunteer counselors offering their services, and from community leaders wanting to establish Bridge Project programs in their own area. Each message represented another opportunity to honor Elena's legacy, another chance to transform pain into purpose, another bridge waiting to be built between military service and family love. The phone rang as I was finishing my correspondence, and I recognized Daniel's number on the caller ID. "Maria, you need to turn on the news. Channel 7 is doing a feature story about the Bridge Project. and they interviewed mom and dad about their experience with military family conflict resolution. I found the remote and switched to the local news station, where my parents' faces filled the screen as they spoke about their journey from resentment to support, from division to unity, from misunderstanding Elena's legacy to embracing it completely. We learned that loving a military family member means accepting the sacrifices that come with service, my mother was saying to the reporter. We learned that distance doesn't diminish love, and that duty to country can coexist with devotion to family. As the news segment concluded and the screen returned to the anchor desk, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and completion. Elena's vision had not only created a program that served military families nationwide, it had also transformed the very family relationships that had inspired her original concern. We had built the bridges she had envisioned, and we would continue building them for as long as military families needed the support and understanding that the Bridge Project provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.